Well, welcome to this edition of Palestine Deep Dive. And today we're joined by Daniel Machover. We've been joined by Daniel before, and it's great to see you again, Daniel.
Thank you.
He is, of course, one of the UK's leading solicitors specialising in police and human rights law. He is head of civil litigation, a partner of Hickman and Rose solicitors in London, and was the co-founder of Lawyers for Palestinian Human Rights, which was founded back in 1988. Now, Daniel's pioneering human rights work has seen him bring cases to the Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court, and to the European Court of Human Rights. And he's also previously managed to obtain arrest warrants in the UK for Israeli political and military figures accused of war crimes against Palestinians under occupation. And that's very much the issue that we're going to be trying to address today. Because as you know, as we all know, last week, the International Court of Justice issued its advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising from Israel's policies and practices in the occupied Palestinian territories, and the consequences of Israel's conduct for other states following an 18-month process. There were public hearings, more than 50 states, including Palestinian, 3 international organizations participated. This long-awaited advisory opinion stated that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories is a clear violation of international law. So not only did we have the ICJ advisory opinion, but we've also, of course, been anticipating what may be coming from the International Criminal Court in respect of arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and leaders of Hamas. Daniel, welcome, and thanks very much for joining us. I'd like to begin by asking you something about the background to last week's ruling by the International Court of Justice, because for all of us who have been watching this for so long, I mean, we all thought that this was already established international law. That affected the occupation was illegal. But why is this judgment in particular important?
Well, first of all, it wasn't established. It was argued, and there are a range of very important legal arguments, some of which had been taken on by various bodies and various UN special rapporteurs had made reports asserting various matters. But that is completely different order to the World Court, the court that is part of the UN legal system, issuing this advisory opinion. So it's a sea change in respect of a whole series of absolutely fundamental findings, going well beyond the Wall advisory opinion 20 years ago. The Wall advisory opinion said some very important things and was not fully followed up in all the fora in which it could have been, both at the United Nations and in national legal systems. But these are different order findings, different order authoritative findings, which will have legal impact. And I can go through them, but I think the important thing to say is, doesn't matter how many UN resolutions there have been outside of Security Council binding resolutions under Chapter 7, and a whole series of very important resolutions which were referred to, by the way, in this authoritative advisory opinion. The advisory opinion is a different order within at international law level. It will be, in my view, appear now in many domestic and international settings as the findings on which we build what happens next. And what happens next is obviously the big question.
Well, thank you. But in practical terms, what difference do you think this ruling could make? I mean, what implications are there for countries such as the UK, for instance, in terms of trade, in terms of military sales?
Massive.
Right.
They should be massive. Unfortunately, I don't think they'll be immediate. They should be immediate. It will take a long time to battle through this, because this hits the politics of the relationships between all countries and Israel, and countries are going to be very reluctant to wrongly, in my view, to review and change their policies in order to comply with their obligations as spelt out in this ruling. And that's the job of everyone who in good faith, wishes to see this judgment, this advisory opinion, I should say, fully implemented in its legal consequences. I think it's important for your viewers, listeners, to just for me to spell out some of the key things. So forgive me, I'm going to read the key things that I think are the most important. I won't read everything because there isn't time. And by the way, these legal arguments will need maturing and developing by experts greater than me in international public international law and its legal consequences. But I think I have enough insight to be able to sort of kick off the debate for people to add to. So the occupation, the continued presence of Israel in the OPT is unlawful. There is an obligation to bring that unlawful presence to an end as rapidly as possible. Those are the words. Israel must cease all settlement activity, evacuate all setters immediately. It has to make reparation for the damage caused. And there's a long list of obligations in the section towards the end on Israel, which include, by the way, the duty to allow the Palestinians to exercise self-determination and to the right to return of those displaced since 1967 from the OPT. So in that sense, the court perhaps went further than many expected. Then we come to those other duties of the various third-party states and the international organizations, and those are spelt out in the advisory opinion. And this is where we get to the really interesting aspects for me of the judgment, and here the advisory opinion. And here I do really want to quote, because I don't think this has been appreciated by many audiences. So forgive me. The key paragraphs, I won't read the whole of it, is 278 and 279. These are when the court is addressing what its advisory opinion means for third-party states. There's a section on the UN, but this isn't it. This is this section, and I will read. Not only is there an obligation not to recognize all of the unlawful matters and wrongful acts that I've listed earlier, the court considers that the duty of distinguishing dealings with Israel between its own territory and the OPT encompasses, inter alia, the obligation to abstain from treaty relations with Israel in all cases in which it purports to act on behalf of the OPT or a part thereof on matters concerning the OPT or a part of its territory, to abstain from entering into economic or trade dealings with Israel concerning the OPT or parts thereof, which may entrench its unlawful presence in the territory, to abstain in the establishment and maintenance of diplomatic missions in Israel from any recognition of its illegal presence in the OPT, and to take steps to prevent trade or investment relations that assist in the maintenance of the illegal situation created by Israel in the OPT. And then it goes on, they're also under an obligation not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by Israel's illegal presence in the OPT. It is for all states, while respecting the Charter, to ensure that any impediment resulting from the illegal presence of Israel in the OPT to the exercise of the Palestinian people of its right of self-determination is brought to an end. Now, all of that means BDS.
Yes.
Urgent, immediate, BDS by all states and by the UN bodies. It can't be interpreted in any other way, because in law, in my view, what this involves, and as I say, international lawyers can opine further, you have to audit your relations by reference to this advisory opinion. What do we do or not do that would require that this advisory opinion requires in order to meet our international obligations? And for me, everything that one does with Israel at the moment renders aid or assistance. It's cut off diplomat. I'm being very serious here, that I don't see how you can interpret this advisory opinion as anything but a call to cut off diplomatic relations, because it aids and assists Israel to have diplomatic relations, to cut off trade relations, to cut off cultural relations, to institute the most comprehensive, like South African type and beyond, sanctions against the state of Israel, because everything that one does in relation to Israel currently aids or assists it in maintaining its current illegal situation. Unless Israel understands that it has become a pariah state, and that these are actual requirements on states, then we're not going to shift the dial. And I have yet to hear a compelling argument that says it doesn't go as far as I have elaborated.
Daniel, that's very, very interesting indeed, because it actually, you mentioned South Africa. The General Assembly passed a resolution uniting for peace, calling for sanctions against South Africa. So under the basis of that ICJ ruling, the General Assembly could do that again. So could the security.
I believe it could and it should. There's also an argument for reconstituting the Special Committee on Apartheid, which was a special committee created during that era, and which really sort of developed all the sanctions policies that were then taken on. So there's a kind of engine room that the General Assembly could reconstitute, which is the special committee, in my view, again, as you rightly said, there is a series of actions the General Assembly should, and I believe there's a very great likelihood it will begin to grapple with these issues. There was a disappointing response by the Secretary General, I think just basically referring the ICJ advisory opinion on to the UN bodies as requested. But Guterres didn't really engage with the issues that I've raised or that you've raised.
Yes, yes, you do wonder how quickly the advice within the system would have moved on that. Actually, I'm not trying to provide an excuse for him, but that's the only. You do wonder sometimes it takes the system a little bit of time to catch up. But I mean, presumably, as the ramifications of this become clearer, because also you mentioned apartheid there, the ICJ were actually very clear about the apartheid system that's being operated effectively in the occupied territory too.
They were. I mean, I would like it to have been even clearer, but I think there is. Well, I know there is no doubt, and what you need to do in that respect is just read paragraphs 225 and 229 together. 225 sets out the provision of the relevant treaty, the International Treaty for the Elimination of Discrimination, the Convention, CERD for short, and that includes in its definition of discriminatory practices the practice of apartheid. And then later in 229, it finds that Article 3 of CERD has been violated by the systematic policies. And that's after a long analysis of the discriminatory policies within the ruling. So yes, there has been an authoritative ruling by the ICJ that the practices in the OPT breached the prohibition against apartheid.
Quite incredible. And I suppose the next question would be, I mean, given that in the past, sections of the international community have ignored rulings by the ICJ, and I'm thinking particularly about the 2004 ruling that the separation wall that the Israelis were building along and through Palestinian territory in the West Bank was in breach of international law. I mean, that was nothing really. It was done by the West in response to that ruling. But do you think that this time things may be different? I mean, given the scope and the depth of these rulings, they're pretty profound. And even though some countries in the West might decide to ignore them, other countries will be going very, very public with all of this, won't they?
I agree. I think you've answered your own question. I mean, disappointing is a kind of understatement about the response of third-party states to the advisory wall opinion 20 years ago. I find it difficult to imagine that we will have as poor a response to compliance and to legal follow-up by both within the General Assembly and across different UN bodies and by individual states. I hope and believe that individual states will follow up on the kind of actions that Turkey took some time ago in terms of its trade relations with Israel following, the appalling events in Gaza. So I think the combination of what is happening right now on the ground and in Gaza and elsewhere across the West Bank, in fact, which is just the level of violations of international criminal law and of legal duties on the part of Israel is legion. And this advisory opinion will combine to create far more momentum than existed post 2004. But we'll have to wait and see. I mean, history will certainly be, and legal history will be a very severe judge and condemn, in my view, the failure, because it carries, it carries consequences. Failing to make sure that international law is abided by does carry consequences. Of course, it carries consequences for the most vulnerable and for the most vulnerable states. But it also carries further consequences about the very, it's an existential kind of threat to international law in the future. Now, of course, powerful states, especially the 5 permanent members at the Security Council, may care less currently. But, the overall impact of this for future international relations is, without getting pompous, is pretty significant. But as I say, the problem is that the kind of collective blind spot of the international community when it comes to Israel-Palestine is so huge that one can't be certain that the right thing will happen. And we'll just have to wait and see. But I believe there will be a lot of legal consequences.
I mean, you do separately, you kind of wonder with political figures, with civil servants, with people who are responsible for making key decisions. Sometimes the idea of self-preservation or thinking about their futures must come into their minds. And I was just briefly, as you were saying that, thinking back to the previous Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, and advice over arms sales to Israel, whether Israel was meeting the international standards for these sales to continue, the advice that they refused to publish, the advice on that David Lammy, the new Foreign Secretary, has said that he will do, I think. But to what extent, I wonder, on both on that question and on the general one, which is, what you're saying now is presumably the kind of advice that the Foreign Secretary should be getting from his senior civil servants. And if not, there is a real failure. And if they're getting the kind of advice that you are giving now to viewers on Palestine Deep Dive, what would your reaction as a minister be?
My reaction as a minister should be, this is a very serious moment for international relations. I'm going to liaise with partners to see what we can do collectively to ensure that these duties on us are properly discharged, and so that we get the quickest possible a compliance by Israel with its section of what its duties and requirements are, as authoritatively handed down by the ICJ in its advisory opinion. But I just think there's too much realpolitik that will interfere in the pure legal advice that the Foreign Secretary should be getting, and the Foreign Secretary should be responding to in like manner. So we've got several impediments, to say the least, to this going the way that it should do and ought to. But we've just got to keep pushing from the outside, and third party states who are going to respond in good faith and in the way that we've just described need to keep having a dialogue with all the other states. And there will be states within the European Union who will take this at a good faith level, possibly states such as Slovenia, Spain, even Ireland. They've already responded in a measured way. In the case of Ireland, I saw the statement made by the Taoiseach not long, within several hours of the advisory opinion. So let's watch out, see what the public statements are, see what the states do, and see whether collective state, supranational state organizations such as the organization of, the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic States, the African Union, the European Union, the Organization of American States, there are collective bodies such as that, and individual states who could start to really move the dial on this. And it's really now in the hands of states and the UN agencies and bodies to pick up the baton that the advisory opinion has literally thrown down and run with it. And civil society is going to be part of that endeavor. And the first thing we need to do, and I'm trying to do in participating in this, is spread the word about what it actually says and what it should mean.
This, of course, at a time when President Netanyahu arrives in Washington. He arrived yesterday. We noticed that he wasn't necessarily greeted by senior administration level figures at the airport, but he is going to be meeting the president, and there'll no doubt be pictures of them both together. And very likely this will send a signal from Netanyahu that actually doesn't really matter what the ICJ says or the ICC has to say or the rest of the world. He's in Washington and nothing's changed. But do you think that things are changing? Do you think that all of this must be having some kind of effect on people within the Israeli government? A concern? They must be at least concerned about what the future holds.
Yeah, I think they are, because they wouldn't have been spying on the International Criminal Court in the way now revealed. They wouldn't have been responding in the way they have and lobbying governments to interfere with all these legal processes, including the current arrest warrant application at the ICC. They wouldn't be mounting, massive diplomatic efforts and political efforts to downplay every single legal process, including the South African case in relation to the Genocide Convention brought at the ICJ, if they weren't concerned about leaving things to lie and just literally ignoring everything without all those efforts. So yes, I think it's having an impact. Is it having the desired necessary depth of impact? No, because we see daily outrages and significant, in my view, certainly very powerful evidence of more and more war crimes, more and more evidence of genocidal acts, of crimes against humanity, just the last 24 hours. I mean, just every 24-hour period, almost, that one looks at. In fact, every 24-hour period, because of the maintenance of the starvation policy, let alone everything else that happens on a daily basis, reveals more and more. So, Mark, I think the problem is that Israel isn't worried enough yet to have the kind of impact that the arrest warrants need to be. Once the ink dries on the actual arrest warrants, which I hope and believe will happen later this year and delayed by the current processes instituted by the UK government, the previous UK government, you may see the kind of impact that should have happened many months ago, which is realizing that they are now not able to travel to any Rome Statute country. Once the arrest warrants are granted, that's it for Netanyahu.
That is actually, Daniel, that is a question I should have asked you earlier, which is the appeals process, the delays. But
Yes.
How long can those delays be?
Months, unfortunately. So what's just happened yesterday is a sort of indication of some kind of timetable. So the UK government, its predecessor, applied for and got the right to put in representations that the court has no jurisdiction because of the Oslo issue. Because of the general election, the previous UK government actually got the deadline extended from the 12th of July to the 26th of July. So this coming Friday, as I speak to you, is the deadline for the current UK government to put in its Oslo Accord issue reason why the court shouldn't grant these arrest warrants. As a result, it's opened the door to this. Even if the new government now decides to withdraw and repudiate that set of legal arguments and to say, in fact, go ahead, the Oslo issue is a dud, ignore what our predecessor said, and just carry on, the door's been opened. So yesterday, a whole legion of other requests for intervention on this issue was granted. And of course, many of the bodies and individuals granted that right by the court yesterday will be against the original British government's intervention that's saying the Oslo argument. By the way, Germany put in a whole different argument about a week ago, saying it didn't have jurisdiction for other reasons to do with a continuing conflict and not being able to grant arrest warrants. So there's a whole series of interventions designed to either scupper the whole process or delay it. It's certainly delayed it already. So we have 17 countries which by the 6th of August, and a whole list of other individuals and organizations, including UK Lawyers for Israel, who are going to be putting in their views to the court on the 6th of August. They will then need to consider all of that, sit and ponder over it for weeks or months. And so I don't see there being a decision on this issue until September at the very earliest. It could go further into the year. I really hope I'm wrong, and they can turn this around in August, but that would be optimistic. So I think what we're looking at realistically is a decision from the International Criminal Court on the arrest warrant application by the prosecutor sometime in September or later.
Right. Well, I mean, that's I mean, you don't think that some of these appeals could be looked at as being vexatious? I mean, you know, such as you mentioned, Oslo being the British government's basis for an appeal, which does, by the sound of things, seem, you know, rather concocted. Even the lawyers putting it together probably didn't think it's going to work.
I mean, Mark, the unfortunate aspect of this is that, and then I don't want to go back into the ancient history of this, the whole way in which this jurisdiction was handled by the International Criminal Court, by the predecessors to the current chief prosecutor, was very cumbersome and long. And it resulted in, and this is the issue really in response to what you just said, it resulted in the court making a ruling saying that the court had the jurisdiction, the chief prosecutor should mount a proper investigation into the allegations put forward by the state of Palestine when it referred itself for investigation. But it said expressly, and therefore left the door open. We've heard these arguments about the Oslo Accords preventing there being, in fact, criminal cases, but that's a decision for a later date. So they actually knew that this issue existed back in February 2021, March 2021, when they addressed this, and they left the door open. And what's happened is nobody until just the dying days of the previous Conservative government walked through that door, unfortunately. And that door was left open by the chamber that granted, or that pushed matters forward finally in 2021. So there you have it. You know, it still doesn't mean that the argument is a strong one, but I'm afraid there was a procedural issue there in that the court left this door open, and which it should have firmly shut back in 2021. And I can go into why I think it's a bad argument, but you know, you and your readers, listeners, viewers will have an opportunity to read literally dozens of arguments on this from the 6th of August. And I'm sure many of these individuals and organizations will publish their detailed views. In a nutshell, in my view, states, when they enter into the process, confer jurisdiction. They don't delegate jurisdiction. And that, I would say, is the short point. And that's why this idea of delegating something you don't have should be a dead duck.
Daniel, finally, because we're running out of time, but it'd be remiss of me not to ask you about the current situation, because in a previous answer a few moments ago, you talked about crimes being committed every 24 hours, the continuing crime of food and starvation,
yes.
The multitude of crimes that are being committed against civilians. Today, we've learned that IDF soldiers are being vaccinated against polio, and that polio is spreading amongst Palestinian civilians. This is just a new horror.
It is.
The polio has been discovered in all the waste and sewage, which is lying uncollected everywhere. The most appalling conditions, as you know, in Gaza, compounded by this latest horror. Where does this sit in terms of international law? The fact that the Palestinians aren't being inoculated against polio, but soldiers are.
Well, it's obviously just a moral and legal outrage. and more outrage upon more outrage. Look, an occupying power as Israel is, and again, it was made clear, by the way, at the ICJ that Israel never ceased to be an occupying power at any point, and it's boots on the ground occupation currently anyway. But you just have a positive duty to ensure, and not just say, oh, we've got this ready, these inoculations ready, and they're sitting in some storage facility. I understand that the Israelis have responded by saying, yes, of course, we'll organize this, but in fact, it's not being rolled out. In fact, the conditions in which polio vaccines can be applied in the middle of this horrific daily outrage are just not. It just doesn't arise, the possibility of doing so, and they know that full well. So they've got a positive duty, as a series of positive duties as an occupier that they've serially breached, and this is yet another really disturbing example. And we will learn more and more such examples, because you can't decimate a country in the way that the Israeli military assault on Gaza and a previous siege did without causing these kind of health crises. So I'd be very surprised if there are a series of other horrible conditions and diseases which are spreading, and which the Israeli authorities have the responsibility to have, first of all, never allowed to happen, but secondly, to deal with, like the vaccinations on polio. So it's almost impossible to sort of fully express how utterly outrageous this is.
Well, on that note, we have to say thank you very much to Daniel for joining us today. I think we come away much better aware and educated as to what the ICJ rulings mean, what the ICC arrest warrants could mean too, and all that is going on. Thank you very much, Daniel, for joining us, and thank you to all of you who are watching. Please do spread this far and wide. There are not very many places where you get to read and hear in such depth and with such knowledge, actually, what is actually going on. And it's very useful for all of us who are concerned and who want to try and do whatever we can. So please do spread this amongst your colleagues and friends. And thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to Daniel again.
Thank you.